Hey, so could you say who you are and what you do within the crypto space?
Yeah, hi. So my name's Nick Almond. I'm the CEO of Finance.vote, which is a soon-to-be launched crypto network focused on governance and voting technology, specifically focusing on DeFi to start with. So I'm relatively new to the crypto space in one sense. I'm going full time into that, but I've been an academic for the last pretty much 20 years. So my background was in physics. I did a PhD over 10 years ago in biophysics, and then ended up going through, I worked in astrophysics for a couple of years, ended up teaching mathematics and cryptography, which is kind of where I discovered Bitcoin. And then kind of got really focused on trying to understand how people learn. So I ended up as a associate dean in learning and teaching. So for the last 7 or 8 years, I've been in this kind of senior management layer of institutions, trying to figure out how to coordinate people in these sort of big institutional environments, to build these kind of ways of collaborating. And in many ways, universities are a bit like decentralized organizations. So I got really interested in governance and organizational theory research, and that's what led me down the merger of this cryptography and governance stuff, and that's what got me sort of really interested in that.
Cool. Yeah, I can see the overlap there between universities and decentralized
Yeah.
organizations. So can you say a little bit about how, like, your new project is, how it speaks to the rest of the crypto community now, and what kind of problem is it solving? And yeah, how it just fits within the space, maybe.
Yeah. So I think that as a kind of, it's definitely targeted to be a kind of address some of the deficiencies in the crypto space currently. I think we're still very, very early. Specifically, I'm trying to level up the kind of governance tooling that's out there at the moment. So we're just sort of getting to the point where we're starting to integrate governance dynamics into some of these networks with sort of human interaction. But in many cases, they're still really super early. So you're starting to see voting dynamics in DeFi networks and things like that, but the governance is still rather immature. And the kind of high risk. So the decisions that happen in DAOs can change smart contracts and have really, catastrophic impacts on the networks if they go wrong. So we're trying to build a kind of mechanism for leveling up DAOs, building sort of more dialogic and discursive dynamics into that. And we're also trying to integrate or build voting tooling, and testing that out in a kind of prediction market type setup to start with. So we use these things called vote markets, where users use, it's a kind of spin on quadratic voting, which allows users to vote on a range of tokens and predict the future of the market. And we distribute voice credits or vote power tokens to those who get it right. So really that sort of mechanism is to try and build and introduce new voting tools into the space, and then start to improve the way that governance is done in DAOs.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, because it does seem to be a huge problem in governance. And so you're trying to make a more elastic system for governance to kind of interact with in certain situations.
I think so. I think adding a bit more dynamism into the governance. At the moment, there's kind of not too much in the way of like parameter spaces around decision making. So if you look at the kind of proposals that are being put forward on some of these DAOs, it's kind of all over the place. There's a missing piece, which is how the trajectory into the proposal formation. So some of these networks have overcome that by just putting a really high barrier to entry on the proposals. So in things like Uniswap for the Uni token and Compound, you need to get 1% of the token supply either delegated to you, or you own it yourself. which is a really high barrier to entry. So just to kind of filter out the proposal systems. So we're calling it second layer governance. We're trying to build these dialogic spaces where somewhere between a forum and a DAO, where people can start to coalesce and form ideas through dialogue, which move into the kind of higher stakes decision-making systems in layer one DAOs.
That's interesting. That's interesting. And it's kind of, we'll go on to the prediction market kind of aspect, but you're kind of relying on the community as well, right?
Yeah, it's very community focused. I mean, I would say a big part of the sort of dynamics is trying to integrate humans into the picture a little bit more. So the kind of Bitcoin philosophy is this kind of governance minimization, ossify a kind of a system, eliminate humans from it as much as possible, turn it into like hardened automated software. I'm kind of interested in the opposite trajectory, which is how we can more effectively integrate human decision making into the evolution of these networks.
That's such an important question. Yeah. What is the best way to integrate humans into the system while still being a decentralized system for you?
Yeah, and it gets kind of exponentially more complicated the more you add in the complexity of humanity into it, the more difficult, more nuanced the system needs to become. And we're just kind of stepping it into that direction a little bit by creating some new kind of spaces and using voting as a way to collapse opinion and dialogue into something that can be stored onto a blockchain. So we use quadratic voting essentially to turn dialogue into numbers.
Can you say a bit about how that dialogical voting, quadratic voting kind of system works?
Yeah, so so in quadratic voting, instead of your kind of typical binary voting system, we're kind of yes/no voting system, where we have a decision that either falls into this reality or this reality, so Brexit or not Brexit, Trump or Biden. Quadratic voting it opens up the sort of parameter space for decision making to allow you to have here's a list of options, and then you distribute some voice credits across these different items in order of preference. And the more you vote on something, the more of your budget of voice credit it costs you. So it has a non-linear cost. So if I vote 5 times on something, it's the square of the votes. So you use 25% or 25 voice credits. So we give everyone 100 voice credits. And you can vote 10 times on one thing, or you could vote, in lots of different ways, lots of different iterations by sharing those voice credits around. And it kind of diversifies the decision-making space, like quadratically.
Okay, I think I get the picture. I'm incredibly non-technical, so you're gonna have to bear with me. But in terms of, so if you give a real life example, so what kind of things are we looking at? So
yeah, so there's some good examples. So that it was invented by a chap called Glenn Whale, who's a Microsoft researcher, and he wrote a book called Radical Markets. And he uses some examples, like, it's to give voice to minority viewpoints. So that if you imagine a society which had a sort of referenda every week, and you were giving a budget of these voice credits you can spend throughout the year, and you might be particularly interested in like gun rights or gay rights, or these kind of there's things that you might care about, but you are a minority participant in the wider society. So you get to vote more than once. So you might really care about education, but less about like refuse collection or something. So by giving people the ability to vote more than once, you can collect better signals from the participants. And it allows people who are in a minority subset of that population to raise their voice above other things.
Okay, and I guess that might be the problem with binary setting, where the dominant person has the dominant narrative in how something works, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think there's a good amount of the polarization that exists in the world comes down to our binary decision-making systems. You know, it's either left or right, or, you know, this or that. And I think that that kind of has resulted in a growing separation between narratives. So I think quadratic voting has a real opportunity to add a bit more nuance into these things. And that kind of minority power thing is an important thing in crypto networks, where, you know, token whales in coin voting can just override the decisions of everyone in the system. So if you look at there's some interesting votes that have happened in MakerDAO, for example, recently, where there was a decision about repaying users who got liquidated in a market crash, and, you know, that essentially the token whales came in and said, no, let's not pay them back, because it was diluting their investment. So there's this issue of plutocratic power that we're trying to kind of solve with our system, which is quite interesting, I think.
Yeah, that does sound interesting. It is a big problem, and I guess like you're approaching it, it happens step at a time, right?
Yeah.
And okay, so how is it different to like Ogre, I never know how to pronounce it, but, you know, Ogre, yeah, and other kind of prediction market kind of systems out there? And, you know, I saw something that you wrote on the Medium about, you know, article about, like, you know, is it just spread betting, and is it these things? And you're kind of interacting with those questions up front, which I kind of quite like. So yeah, so what do you think about your project's relation to those projects?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm fascinated by prediction market systems. I think that they're really quite powerful. The idea of integrating markets as a kind of consensus mechanism, really interesting. I mean, it's Augur is a broad spectrum prediction market system. You can ask any question on it. So you can ask, you know, there's some current live markets on who's going to be the NBA Player of the Year, and, you know, alongside the who's going to win, Trump or Biden. And what that does is it's an unlimited decision space, and there just isn't enough users at the moment to provide a market for all of that decision making. So we're a prediction market in the sense that we use markets to settle outcomes of votes. But we're limited at the moment. We're limiting the decision-making space to just things with existing markets. So we're not trying to create our own market to settle the system. We're using existing market data and letting people vote on which tokens they think are going to perform the best over periods of time. So we're different in setup in the way of Augur, in the sense that we're not this broad spectrum prediction market system. And we don't need an order book. So Augur runs on an order book. It's like they're the same as interacting with an exchange. You buy Trump tokens or not Trump tokens, and you need a buyer, you need a counterparty for your trade. We use token economics to generate a reward pot that the users contribute via a vote, just by sending a transaction, and this reward pot is shared to the winners. So instead of needing a counterparty, the network is the counterparty, and that kind of solves some of this liquidity issues that you find in prediction market systems. And, you know, that there is prediction market systems that are centralized and have a lot more users, because they don't really suffer with this liquidity problem quite as much. So we're tackling it in a different way. For the moment, we're a prediction market system focused on the markets, pre-existing markets. So we're a little bit different in that respect. Okay, so
that sounds interesting. Can we work through like a concrete example? So what kind of one particular thing might be on your prediction system?
Yeah, so we're going to use token lists. So we might have, let's say, the DeFi top 10. So you've got things like wrapped Bitcoin, Uniswap token, Synthetics, SNX token in a list, and the users will have 100 V tokens, the voice credits tokens, to spend on that. So they could go 10 votes on wrapped Bitcoin if they think Bitcoin's going to go up the most in a week. or they can say 3 on Bitcoin, 4 on Uniswap, 3 on SNX. So they're hedging their bets, if you like, across a range of tokens. And then there's a voting period for a week and then a market period for a week. So the votes close and then the market does what the market does. And then the people who voted on on a winning token get a share of that reward pool. So it's literally just, it'll look a bit like CoinGecko or something, but you'll be able to vote on the tokens and delegate your consensus of what's the best token in that week, if you like.
Right. Yeah, that's a pretty good example. Yeah.
Yeah. The added twist is that we give more vote power to those who are correct over time. So if you vote 6 on Uni token, for example, and it turns out to be the highest gain token that week, we'll give you 36 more voice credits to vote in the next round. So essentially, as these things iterate, the vote power swings towards the correct.
That's kind of interesting. Yeah. And I mean, so like, would you agree this is kind of like, this kind of wisdom of the crowd kind of logic, right? So where, like, wisdom of the crowd logics have failed before, has it failed because, I'm kind of new to that kind of thinking. Has it failed because of people being aware of like the effects of their action almost?
It's a complex system, right? So there's something in this wisdom of the crowds phenomenon, but it's kind of fragile. There's crowds aren't wise. It's a bit of a misnomer. There's signal in this kind of like aggregated collective intelligence thing, but it needs filtering. So this is why we've got this mechanism of feeding more vote power to people who are correct in this kind of meritocratic system. So in this kind of raw sense, there's sometimes things there, but what happens when people become self-aware of it, and whether people are influencing, how influence plays into it, whether the size of crowd matters, we kind of don't really know yet. It's really early research. But there's definitely something there. But I think it's a bit of a misnomer to say that, if you aggregate all these people just in a kind of raw average, that they're going to be correct about something. I don't think that's necessarily true. What there needs to be is a kind of intermediary layer that filters out people who are providing good signal from the bad signal, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, that's interesting. And also maybe keep it. Yeah, that's such a complex phenomenon to kind of, there is something kind of unknown happening there, isn't it, within the wisdom of the crowd, and it's trying to understand what that mechanism is and why people are sometimes better at predicting together as a crowd rather than not, right?
I completely believe in collective intelligence. So I've seen the power of what happens if you just put 10 people in a room with a shared problem. And so as a sort of learning theorist for the last 10 years, I teach people how to teach, and really all you need to do is create an environment where a lot of people think about the same thing, and a sort of and kind of interesting stuff emerges out of it. And the role of a kind of facilitator or teacher in that environment is to sort of tune up the good stuff. So there's a real power in collective intelligence. I've seen it with my own eyes, and I've seen it at the institutional scale. So I'm really excited about what happens if we do that online. What happens when we start to be able to do this. And for me, voting tools is the way you can start to harness some of that potential. But I'm under no illusions this is going to just like predict the future of markets from the outset. If that just ends up as a fun voting game for people, that'll be fine, because it proves out the voting technology that I can use in other things for so it's purely a mechanism for battle testing my voting tech to start with. But you never know. Over time, people might start be able to gain some market insights from this. If enough people play and if the curation mechanisms works, who knows? It might be interesting.
Yeah, no, that does sound interesting. And I think what struck me again, your comparison to kind of learning and universities is that yeah, it's kind of how I've been thinking about like the what people call like, the crypto and blockchain community in London as well, and the values of that community. And
Yeah,
how do you structure this community to explore ideas in the best possible way, and kind of the values that are emphasized within kind of any open, even like GitHub and stuff like that. It's always openness
mhm,
that's expressed as a value
yeah,
to explore ideas together, like in a classroom you're talking about, right? To be openness
yeah,
is emphasis as a value to kind of explore ideas, which is really interesting. But then there is this thing about scams coming in. If you're open to everything, then you have to kind of, are you open to scams as well? And then it's kind of about this balance between openness and closure, right? To kind of
yeah,
fine tune
exactly.
ideas.
So I mean, I'm writing an article at the moment called "Permissionless Comes at a Cost."
Mm,
And when you've got these kind of open systems where anyone can launch a market and anyone can mint a token,
mm,
of course, it introduces this kind of Wild West dynamic where all sorts of dodgy stuff happens. And in fact, good ideas are hard. So it's 95% bad ideas and scams and clones and lazy forks and all that sort of stuff, which is a lot of what we're trying to address. Is can we put all that into a list and let people sort it into the good stuff, and at least the interesting stuff or the stuff that's getting attention will at least float to the top. But yeah, we should be mindful of the fact that permissionless systems and things like Bitcoin, there is a cost to these things. It's not, and regulators are really struggling with how to handle this stuff. Because they can be used for illicit things, and there's not much you can do to stop it, and that's kind of not going to go away anytime soon. So I do think how the community coordinates and builds its value structure is going to be super important, and because I think it's the creators in this space that kind of need to lead by example a little bit,
mm.
and show the right way to do these things. And you can already see this in the space that ideas like the fair launch idea has started to become a kind of dominant paradigm. So these almost like memes of values are starting to take hold within the space. Um,
Can you expand on what do you mean by that? The fair launch thing. I don't.
yeah, so there's I think it was started by the YFI project by Yearn Finance. I mean, how fair this was, we don't really know yet. But I mean, it's the idea that the holders don't take a big pre-mine of tokens, for example.
Mm-hmm.
All the tokens were distributed back to participants in this kind of everyone's on the same playing field sort of phenomenon. And a lot of these sort of yield farming tools and things have all followed that same paradigm afterwards. They're starting to change a little bit again, but I found it interesting that this idea of a fair launch, that the creator isn't necessarily got too much of an asymmetric advantage to the
Mm.
users, has propagated a little bit around the space. And so I think it shows you that there's the potential for values to emerge in the system that are positive and take hold.
Yeah, and I guess it shows again there has to be some kind of like flat hierarchy for ideas to thrive, like in a classroom, which I find interesting. That
Yeah,
there has to be this almost pedagogical system where there's a lot of uncertainty and people are thinking through this. And you're right. If there's a hierarchy, it kind of diminishes that kind of return in value from that community.
yeah. And I think that you can't get away from hierarchies, and there's an element of hierarchy in this system, but in this kind of emergent thing. What you don't want is the hierarchy to be driven entirely by token stake, because that just gives all the power to the token whales. Um,
Yeah,
so it's
absolutely.
finding ways to like rebalance the hierarchy to more meritocratic foundations,
Mm.
is the kind of challenge, I think.
Nice, nice. Okay. And um, okay, so maybe you touched a bit on a bit about regulation. So like, yeah, what is it like? How is it? It must be difficult to kind of like work with regulation at the moment
Yeah, I
on this
mean,
kind of stuff.
there's a lot of interesting developments in this space, and I mean, if you're looking at the DeFi space at the moment, it's moving so fast. It would be exceptionally difficult to these kind of new token economics primitives, I call them, these new ways of managing tokens, like these things like yield farming. I mean, I feel sorry for the regulators for having to sit down and trying to figure this stuff out, because, you know, is this legal? Who knows? It's something brand new. So there is this issue of the space moving far faster than any regulator could ever keep up with. So for now, I think we need to start, you know, almost self-regulating ourselves and finding mechanisms for keeping people safe in this space, allowing people to interact with this, with some real assets without getting hurt that much. And I think part of that is education, and part of that is building tools that allow us to filter out the bad stuff easily. So, you know, the regulation's not going to stop. These things are going to, they'll meet in the middle somewhere, I think. Mm-hmm. But the nature of permissionless systems, I think it's going to be interesting to see where things like Uniswap go. Mm-hmm. There's simply just no stopping Uniswap now. So you can't shut it down. So how do you then deal with that? So I think there's some interesting questions to come out of that in the future.
So how do you think about, you know, in kind of this practice of thinking about, like, you know, how to keep people safe? Like what have you found useful in kind of thinking through that question?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it's like, just don't buy any of the obviously, you know, daft stuff. It's kind of, it's quite obvious. The longer you've spent in the space, it's kind of obvious what the kind of bad stuff is, to be honest. It's the people who are sort of new into the space who get sold into a meme, and you can't go wrong with you can go wrong with just buying Bitcoin if you buy it at the wrong time and you buy too much of it. But this is what happens when you lower access to financial systems, which is a powerful and important thing to do. But at the same time, it's risky. And I think it's just about understanding risks and educating people is the thing we need to do. And I think the responsibility is on us to do that as a space, because we can't be sitting around waiting for regulators to tell us what to do, because they wouldn't have the first clue of how to understand any of it.
Yeah, it is a complex world, isn't it? And it's just a side point that you picked up, also something that I'm interested in, the idea of a meme currency. Like, just a side thing. What do you understand by that term? Like, what does it mean when you...
So I think there was this kind of interesting phenomenon of, so it started with this kind of, a good example is they call them food tokens. There was a project called Yam, which catastrophically failed within 48 hours or thereabouts. But it collected $500 million in no time at all. And even though it was a monumental failure because there was a bug in the smart contract, fortunately people didn't lose too much money on it, but it kicked off this kind of range of forks of people mixing and matching these different smart contracts that are out there. And they all just picked up these kind of food memes. So they're kind of meme forks. They're like ideas represented by a meme. It's all kind of weird. But it's funny how these things, ideas propagate through the space in that way. So there's something quite interesting in it, even though it seems kind of trivial and silly. You can almost see ideas, you know, transmit through the crypto space, through the life cycle of these tokens, which is part of what I'm trying to chart, if you like, is, can you pick up on ideas and attention and that kind of stuff in a way to generate a little bit more data and insight on what people are interested in at the time.
Yeah, especially like, I think why I'm interested in so I do a lot of work with memes and currencies and how people tell stories about the crypto world in using memes. And when I'd say that, people always think that's ridiculous, but it's kind of about, you know, picking up on these ideas, right, of the culture of the crypto community and finding out which ideas are transmitting and which ideas are gaining ground and which memes are popular, because memes kind of influence the price in this marketplace, really.
They do. And memes are like mind share you know, and we don't advertise through conventional channels. It's just, you know, you don't see the adverts for cryptocurrencies on the TV and things like that, or rarely, at least anyway. So the way that they propagate is through these pictures and things, which is quite interesting.
So what do you think is the like, you know, what is your vision for the crypto community, or like what is it that drives your kind of work within this crypto world, I guess? Like, yeah.
I mean, I have to say it shifted over the years. I mean, I kind of fell into that kind of, you know, Bitcoin maximalist sort of almost crypto anarchist sort of vibe for a while. And it just feels a bit naive now. I think the reality of it is that, you know, that we're going to go through this like decades long process of digital transformation as, you know, our old systems start to be digitized and things like that. And I just think blockchain is going to have a really important part to play in transforming organizations and societies. And I think there's this massive new potential for humans to collaborate at scale, and work with one another in ways that have never been possible before. And it's to do with this kind of trust architecture thing. It's weirdly, by trusting each other less, we get to collaborate more, you know, and blockchains create this possibility for us to just collaborate in entirely new ways. Like DAOs are phenomenal things. Pool some money and decide how we spend it together. It's a very simple idea, but it could be very, very transformative. And you know, and this is why I'm sort of focusing on voting technology at the moment, because that's how you feed this collaboration through many people. And when you add the money dimension to that as well, there's a lot of potential for, you know, productive action outside of the institutional setting. So, you know, collective organization has been within the domain of, like, you know, the firms and organizations and institutions, and there's the potential for that to happen on the internet now. And I think that's really quite exciting.
Yeah, that is exciting. And like, you know, when governance structure using tokens, like you mentioned before, it can create this hierarchy where, like, you know, people can game the system, right? And kind of game using metrics, and you kind of have to develop a layered structure, and you call it a second layer structure that kind of fights that kind of gaming kind of tendencies that forms in markets, right? Bull markets. And how do you design a system that fights that? And you're trying to design that, I guess.
It's exactly. I mean, so what you do is you make the games, you know. So that if you think about Bitcoin's actually it's a crypto economic game, where everyone's sort of competing to find a Bitcoin block for the reward, for example. And I think there's a lot of potential in designing these different sort of games that when there's a game that's easier to play than fight against, that's how you sort of mitigate against these gaming sort of thing. You're almost playing them at that game. So you're saying, here, if you want to play a game, this is it. And you build these kind of structures within smart contracts that actually, if you play them the way that they're designed to play, you'll be rewarded for it, through this kind of principle of mechanism design. So yeah, so by understanding the fact that it's definitely going to be gamed and thinking about how that happens, you can sort of design that in, if you like.
Yeah, that's a super interesting idea. I'd be really curious to see where this goes for you and stuff. Like, yeah, it sounds really interesting.